Yeah,
Yep, I'm recording. Great.
Excellent.
Okay.
Oh, we have Kyle. I think we need Mike. Let me ping him.
He's on his way.
Okay. Right, so are we waiting for someone? Let's see.
We were waiting
Looks like-
for you.
Okay, well, I'm here.
Let's get started. Shall I share my screen with your power set shards proposal, Mike? Do you want to do that?
Sure. Mike Birch is here, good, to represent the opposition.
Okay, let's get started. I am recording this meeting. There was a request to record it, so I'm doing that.
Okay.
Carry on.
So in Casper, you have to know about all the validators that are participating. So a validator is a participant in that protocol. We call the set of all validators V. Then Greg's sharding proposal, the simplest case is what I tried to capture here. We've got a non-empty finite set R of regions, and then a function that assigns to each region a non-empty subset of validators. Regions get to set slashing criteria, so for performance, bandwidth, storage capacity, and so on. If you want to be in a region, you have to meet the criteria. The set of namespaces is the positive power set of the set of regions. That is, all of the non-empty subsets of the set of regions. For each namespace, we assign a countably infinite set of names to that namespace. The validators for the namespace S join T are the validators of S union the validators of T. But the names are not the same as those in the names corresponding to the namespace N sub S and N sub T. Deploying code in a namespace with many joins will be more expensive since more validators have to validate the messages. The execution may be slower or otherwise constrained because of the different criteria on the regions. Terms are colored with a namespace. Every input expression is associated with the namespace of the names it's listening on. Cross namespace joins are forbidden, so the namespace is unique. Every output expression is associated with the namespace of the name being sent on. And that gets clarified a bit later. When sending or listening on a public name, it must be annotated with the namespace. So @1 doesn't make sense, but @1:A or :S or T does make sense. Every new production annotates the new name with the namespace. Other productions live in the nearest enclosing input. For sending, there's an example there. We've got process listening on B and one sending on B. B is in the namespace big B, Y is in the namespace big Y. Then we've got another process listening on little y in the namespace big Y. When those two, when the two processes in B interact, the resulting thing is a send on Y, which is necessarily, at that point, in the namespace B, because it just interacted there. So in order for Y to have any effect, it needs to be moved over to the namespace big Y. And in a comment below, clarified that in order to do that in such a way that it can't be rolled back in B, you have to wait for finalization that yes, we really do intend to send this message over to Y. Can you scroll down, please, Meta?
One way you could do that is just the Y validators wait until they've received that send from enough of B, because they know who the B validators are.
That's true, but that's effectively getting finalized. So I guess the validators in B don't need to know that all the others in B know about it, but the ones in Y need to know that enough of them in B know about it. So that's a subtlety, but basically the same. For data feeds, sender pays, so you create a return channel, say data feed bang, return channel to get the data from the data feed and then read it out. Rather than just writing replicated data to a public name, you have to serve each client individually. Joins between names that are not in the same namespace is a type error. If a process in the namespace B and that and Y which wish to race, then they need to pick names that are in the process. I'm sorry, pick names that are in the namespace B join Y. If neither process, the one in B and the one in Y, know about each other, but some other process wants to join messages from both of those, then you can't do that in a semantics preserving way. The best you can do is forward stuff from B to B join Y and from Y to B join Y and then join there. That means that certain messages will be consumed even out of the B and Y namespaces, even though the join may not occur. But that's the cost here of avoiding the merge blocks and the issues with merge blocks that were raised earlier. So Greg, does this correspond to something that, I mean, does this capture what we talked about there in the senior commons?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty close.
Okay. Objections, questions?
So I don't think that this proposal is really that different from what I have in terms of like the I don't know, the flavor of the ideas. Like I feel like we have more in common than what's different here. I'd say one of the big differences is that the coloring that you're doing here is based on private, or I guess just sort of random names, if you will, or unspecified names that sort of are in each of the namespaces, right? You never say how the set of names is divided up. Whereas mine is based on a particular type of name and sort of like expanded out from there. But again, I think this is what is presented here is just kind of like a slightly more general version of what I've got on the other page. But one of the things that I think is different in terms of our approach to this is you're saying that you don't need merge blocks ever, right?
Yes.
And the way you're getting around that is the only way you can move code is after finalization has happened.
Yeah, and the only kind of code that moves is a send.
No, a receive can move too, Mike.
How do you anticipate that working?
The same way, all of the names that are received on have to be in the same namespace.
That's true. That's totally true.
But it will migrate just like a send. I mean, like the simplest case is a receive on a single channel moves just like a send would.
Yeah, so I think that in terms of philosophy of like how things are working, that sounds like it's more along the lines of like going back to our discussion in November. This is more along the lines of we halt until a decision is made, right? So this sounds like it's
one of the benefits of this one is that because joins happen in a separate namespace, it can never be the case that B can prevent Y from making progress on things that happen only in Y. Whereas with the merge block, one or the other has dominance over, one has dominance over the other and can either force them to lose all forward progress by eventually approving a merge block, or and in the other case, one can. Wow, somebody's static really loud. Okay.
Yeah.
So there was either preventing preventing forward progress, or trying to remember what the other one was. But either way,
or there's an exponential blow up of speculation.
Right.
I couldn't make out what
there was an exponential blow up of speculation. So if you were allowed to speculatively continue executing based on whether the race was won or not, then as more and more, with very few joins, it would cause exponential number of paths that would need to be followed to continue executing.
Yeah.
But in this version, yeah, you're right. You can't influence what goes on in another namespace per se, but you can, if the other namespace sends something to the join, expecting you to also send something to the join, you can delay that indefinitely.
Sure, you can delay the one joined thing, but you can't prevent all progress in another namespace this way.
Right. So the other thing about this that I think is important to talk about is how things change over time, right? Again, because the namespace definition, exactly what names are in a namespace, is sort of left ambiguous. How does the protocol respond to changes in usage? So for example, if two namespaces suddenly are communicating a whole lot, maybe it would make sense to reorganize it so that it's actually on one namespace.
It is one namespace if they're talking to each other, right? It's the joined one. I guess not necessarily. So if they're merely sending to each other and having code execute in each other's spaces, there's the finalization cost that could slow it down. But they can certainly choose to communicate in the joint namespace.
So there's a straightforward way. So if you want to merge two regions, that's straightforward. Because what you do is you migrate all code to the the meet namespace so that there's nothing left in the two regions, and then like when that migration is finalized, you just cut them off. They're empty. Right now you have one fewer namespace. And the way that you would create a new one is you just join an empty one, right? That fits in this protocol just fine.
But the code would have to be the thing doing the merging of the regions, right?
By the code, what do you mean the code?
No, the user code.
Oh, yeah, that's a. Yeah, we don't want to do that.
No, you could merge two regions so that they were the same region without the users knowing, right? Like. But I'm not sure you can split it back out without them knowing.
So if you're merging them, then they are able to do what was before cross namespace joins.
That's right.
But they just didn't know they could.
Right.
Yeah, in Michael's proposal, he talked about tagging the names with a structure that allowed you to prove that you could piece them apart at a later time. I'm not sure that I would prefer to just join an empty region and let code move that you wanted to move.
And people would subscribe to some feed to learn when new regions were created?
Or presumably they would be creating the new region because they had code they wanted to put in it.
Well, no, well, who's the agent? What agency is creating the new region?
See, that's a good question.
So right now, what I'd much prefer until we have more experience with this is that the protocol is in charge of the creation and destruction and merging of regions, and that user code is not. Because if we let user code do that, then that feels like a major security problem.
No, user code cannot create regions.
So can you explain why you think it's a security problem for user code to participate in creating the structure of the network?
Yeah, because then they can manipulate it so that fewest validators possible are in the region that they're running code in, and then there's low security for that code to run.
So if I have an application, so you're, okay. Let me repeat that back and make sure I understand. You're saying they could look around for regions that have few validators, and having found one, they could then place their contracts in that region, and their security would be, whose security is reduced?
So the total security of the network is reduced, not their security.
And why is that?
Because now you get potential for double spend, right?
No.
So in order to double spend, you need validators in...
I just need one region
with a cabal or a coalition of validators that wish to double spend.
No, that's not necessarily true, right? Like,
and it gets worse because of the situation that Kent and Michael and I identified earlier this morning, which is that if you allow for easy reconfiguration, like if you allow for validator level reconfiguration of the network as opposed to protocol, then essentially the validators take control of the namespaces below some point, and now you have a cabal that's working from the ground up. So they're looking for the smallest validator level fringe, right? So that they can buy them out, and then they have control from the top and from the bottom. So you get whole chunks of the network that are suddenly no longer censorship resistant.
Well, I just want to clarify that I think the attack vector is a DOS, though, not a double.
I don't know that it's just a DOS. I'm concerned that it's a lot more than a DOS.
It's just a DOS because you can have some other you can have a validator not in S watching S and slashing them for contradictions.
So the read-only nodes?
Yeah, you can have any other validator can watch some other region in which they're not participating and slash them for bad behavior.
That's a good point.
So it doesn't, it's only a DOS. It doesn't lead to double spend because even if you have a tiny region, right, like if there's anything economically valuable going on there, you're going to want to watch it, even if you're not one of the validators in it.
Okay, but still, it's a DOS is still a DOS.
It feels like the validators can always DOS the namespace they're validating if they agree to.
Yes, the validators can always DOS the namespace they're validating.
But that's separate, right? Because now they're economically harming themselves, right? What we're concerned about is potentially outside influences in coordination.
I don't see how my choosing to deploy a contract to a namespace with a small validator set allows anyone other than the validators to DOS my contract.
So I think one thing that I think there still might be an issue is that I think this model doesn't have a hierarchy, right? Might say if I'm correct.
It does have a hierarchy.
Well, not in the sense that you can't from a higher shard basically hijack a lower shard, right? They're like independent in a sense.
You can, but all the validators from the lower shard have to participate in validating the higher shard, right? So if you're a validator in A, you have to validate A union B, which means the union of all the shards is validated by everyone.
It's expensive.
Extremely. It's Bitcoin.
So is it the case that the union of all names can change or like basically stall a smaller shard or like a subset?
No, that's why they're disjoint.
Yeah, okay,
So-
yeah, exactly.
So say you have a region that has lots of validators in it and a region that has just a few validators in it. When they communicate in the join of the two regions, then the larger validator set could play the role of a cabal or a coalition and overwhelm the smaller one.
Yeah.
But they can't prevent progress from happening in the smaller one. They can't affect that smaller one's communications with other regions that don't involve the large one. So it's only the interaction between the large and the small that the large one can throw its weight around in.
Yeah, I see. So I guess we're sort of we are definitely away from like Vlad's model of allowing. I guess you mentioned this earlier, I might say, but like we no longer allow for, I guess, hijacking the smaller or namespaces.
That was what this proposal was intended to address, was the exponential blow up or the dominance idea where one can prevent progress in another.
Yeah. Okay.
What's to prevent? So let's suppose that A anticipates that contracts in B will be transacting with it, and it wants to hijack. What you're saying is it can't prevent B from making progress on its own, but it can. The validators in A could approve an update to their own validator set, which is essentially an ant army, right? A zillion tiny validators, and then they could all go into A union B and mess around in there, right?
In A union B, A can decide the outcome of races. If A is the big one, say.
Right, but the big one is not a fixed property. The big one is a function of the validator set, which A also controls, right? The validators in A also control their own validator set.
No, the validators in A are controlled across the entire set.
So they have to get the entire network to agree to accept validator updates?
That's right.
Okay.
We expect that these will happen fairly at a fairly low frequency. Everybody has to know the validators in A anyway. So
and they're putting it. They have to put up a stake that the rest of the network accepts in order to get bonded, right? So
yes,
it's not like okay, that makes sense. So will the bonds be roughly the same across the network?
My anticipation was that they would not, in that you could be in a super fast, powerful region, and you'd have high requirements on your performance, and you'd have to pay a bunch to get in. You'd also have cheap regions that you could get into more easily. You brought up the point last time we talked about this, about the cheap regions having things joining and leaving all the time, which requires attention from the rest of the network. I don't have a good answer for that at the moment.
But it's relative. So a model that Michael Birch and Kent were looking at was within a particular region, it's relatively homogeneous, right? So there's not a big disparity of.
Sure, within a region, they would all be close to the same.
Yeah.
So this is something that is not necessarily about the proposal itself, but it's something that Nash has brought up with me before. And so I just wanted to ask the group, how are we enforcing hardware constraints?
So the way that I usually frame this is to say there are some contracts that are going to be like things like backups, where you want reliable disk, but it can be fairly slow. And there are other contracts that are going to be things like indexes, where you want incredibly fast disk, but it can be less reliable because you'll replicate. And you want to pay for those, like the people who are providing the resources want to get paid for them differently because the hardware acquisition, the capital costs for that type of machine are different depending upon what you're buying.
Yeah, but
so how do you?
Well, yeah, what you need is some kind of cryptographic evidence that they have in fact ponied up that kind of hardware.
Yeah, and that's what I'm asking about, is how do you provide that kind of evidence, right? This is something that Vlad has mentioned before as being, it's impossible or undecidable to figure out whether an issue is on your end or their end, right? Am I not receiving messages because my connection is down, or is it because their connection is down? It's undecidable as to which is the case.
Well, in that case, each one slashes the other for not being up, and then the larger portion of the network wins.
Right. So when we're talking about more general hardware validation, like disk read-write speed, and so on. Ultimately, everything is bottlenecked by network, right? Like the only way we can know if something was written to disk or not is if, you know, we receive a message that says it was, and, you know, how do we know it actually was, right? Like I don't really see how one can objectively verify hardware constraints.
Yeah, the proof of storage, there are protocols for that, but you don't store anything useful. There are some people downstairs who are trying to get a proof of storage system set up where you're actually storing useful stuff, but I haven't seen any proofs that it works.
So actually, both Vlad and a Russian hacker have a proof of storage algorithm where you get relatively short cryptographic proofs. Sorry, it's proof of content, not necessarily proof of storage. Proof that you've got the file that you say you do. But that's a small piece of the puzzle, right? If we're talking about also, you know, potentially bandwidth and compute cycles, there would have to be other notions of reasonable evidence for the service level agreement. We could do it the other way around, right? You punish if you can find evidence that they don't.
Yeah, that would be the approach that I was going to suggest as well. Slash them if they can't handle the traffic.
Yeah.
Right, or give them an opportunity to like bow out gracefully and get ejected, but without slashing, but then aggressively slash if they don't take it.
Yeah, we published the requirements, and we expect that if you meet those requirements, you won't get slashed.
Yeah.
But we expect you to keep up. And that's definitely a reasonable way to do it at first, at least.
So I might publish a requirement like, you know, you need at least this much disk I/O and this many compute cycles and so on. And so someone who meets that comes along and joins. But then they're
Yeah,
their network connect actually are. Their requirement for disk and compute, it was because their network bandwidth is bad.
As you observed, right? Like there's no real difference between having a device on a bus, or not having a device on a bus and having a device on a bus that doesn't work, right? So at the end of the day, all of the resources are behind network connections, and the network connection is a part of the functioning of the device. And so you don't treat them as separate things, right? You just observe that everything has a network connection. Even your main RAM in your PC is networked to your CPU, right? And there's a protocol that they engage in with latency and all that stuff. So forget about the difference between network and hardware. You want storage, and the storage has to have a certain latency guarantee. It has to have certain, you know, you have to say, I can meet this and I have this much of it. And then the blockchain contracts that are running on the blockchain can choose to schedule storage on you and periodically come around and ask you if you've really stored it, right? And that's a program you can write in Rolang. That's the reason you do it that way, is that this doesn't have to be a fundamental part of the protocol. You just have to support it.
And if you can show that you gave them the data, they accepted it, and then when you ask for it, they didn't give it back, that's evidence that they haven't stored it and you can slash them.
Exactly.
But you also have to be sure that the cost of not returning the data to you is covered by the reward you get for slashing them.
Yeah, that's right.
And this works perfectly with the way that most transient systems failures actually work, right? So if I have a data center that's full of machines and I put them on the blockchain and I say, here's my capacity, and I quantify it somehow, and every now and then I have a failure, the failure is brief enough that the blockchain never notices, right? Then I'm not going to get slashed. Like, I'm doing a good enough job, right? I'm meeting my SLA, right? If my failures are so severe that the blockchain becomes unstable and everyone starts noticing, then they'll be able to produce cryptographic evidence that we've messed it up, and I should get punished for that by losing, capacity contracts essentially. And this is exactly how operators think about their business already.
So I think it works great for storage. I'm less convinced that it works for compute, and even less convinced it works for bandwidth.
I don't think you can't separate storage and bandwidth, I don't think.
Well, I agree with that. But if someone is simply making no claims about storage, but are making claims about bandwidth, I don't think we can support that. At least I don't know how to do it.
Oh yeah, I don't even know what that would mean. Like what are you going to transmit? Right? Like, I've got all this bandwidth, but I'm going to transmit just ones.
Well,
it's not like it's back
bandwidth. I mean, the validators may also be making claims about what oracles they provide, and those that performance.
Yeah, for example.
The only bandwidth constraint that I could see is like handling a certain number of messages from other validators in this region, right? You're expected to handle this much traffic from other validators. And if you can't keep up, then you get slashed. That's the only other bandwidth constraint I could imagine.
Yeah, I'm not even sure that you can get bandwidth contracts from ISPs really anymore, right? Like they've all gone to agreements at this point that are like that include lots of bursting provisions, because you can't guarantee. It's very hard to guarantee bandwidth, right?
Yeah. So
I think you're exactly right. We just don't do it because we can't. That's not how people work. Like, that's not how the network works anymore.
Right, but what about compute?
What about compute?
Well, can someone say, we got a narrow pipe here, but once you get us the stuff, we can calculate lightning fast?
Sure. That's fairly reliable, right?
Yeah. So how do we slash on the basis of that?
It's just about keeping up.
Because lots of other people are going to provide the same service, right? So essentially the idea is that if you don't provide it, someone else will provide it. And if enough of the validators in your region are able to provide the service at a speed that beats your speed, then you'll get slashed, right? So if you can't handle the work, stay out of the region.
Sounds like a t-shirt.
It's ironic. We've been looking for a t-shirt.
Okay. All right. So I still want to see this worked out in detail, but I'm happy to concede that at least for storage we've got a solution, and there seems to be a decent one for compute. But I'd like to see the details on that.
So, do you mind if we back up a bit? And I understand we're trying to remove this, exponential blow up thing, but I think as a result, we're basically preventing a token that spans all names, right?
No.
Well, I mean, we aren't preventing it, but we're forcing it to be on the union.
No.
Of all, right?
No.
Nope. Mike and I worked out on the board how you would handle running like you can split Rev across all the different regions, and if you want to trade, like there's a straightforward way to lift the two wallets that want to do an exchange up to the meet and do the exchange and lift them back down. It was dead simple.
So when you lift them up and then back down, you still preserve all the security properties that you would have otherwise had in like a hierarchical model, I don't know how else to describe that, but
Yes.
okay. Yeah. That would be cool if I could.
Yeah, I'd like to see that protocol too.
What happened?
I think Greg's phone may be dying.
Well, he's picking up his daughter or dropping her off for violin lesson or something.
I see.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, it's all right. So the protocol is basically to take standard cell contract, like that we turn into a wallet, and you just give it a move command. And what happens is that takes and it moves it moves the state to a different name and the channel you're listening for commands to a different name. So like the protocol to do an exchange is both sides do a move, you do the exchange, and then you do a move afterwards. Back down to the base region.
But then Ken's question was about the security properties, right? So if you're basically all the different namespaces are independent, right? So they like you don't have any security guarantees about what's going on in any namespace other than your own and anything that you're unioned in with, right? Because then you have at least the properties that you have.
That's not quite true. You can slash for bad behavior in a namespace you are not a member of.
You can, but that would mean, yeah, okay. So I guess what you're saying is that if you are suspicious of something going on, you should just watch that namespace for a little while and sort of see if anything shady's happening.
What I'm saying is that you could run, like, you don't have to be you could run a single validator and then like have your organization runs one, watcher rack that watches everything, right? But right, to make, or watches all of the contracts for this particular asset, right? Like across all the regions to make sure that nothing fishy is going on, and you can slash them. You have to watch them, but like you can slash them for bad behavior in the region you're not in. So it requires a watchman.
Now, when you have two contracts like the wallets running in the joined space, it may be that if one is large and the other is small, the one that is large can overpower the one that is small to win specific races. However, in a wallet exchange, just sending money from one to the other, there is no race to win. It's just it either happens or it doesn't.
Yeah, if there is a race, it's an attempted double spend.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So the assumption is that anyone who has, or at least some people who have interest in the proper functioning of the network will be watching the network. And so as long as it never gets too big such that a single watcher can't cover it all, then it's all good.
Well, I mean, watching scales, because you can just throw another machine and say, you watch that half, you watch that half, because you trust all your watchers.
Right. Sorry. By one watcher, I meant like one entity who is deploying watchers, right? Yes, of course, in principle, you can deploy new hardware, but like that's subject to costs and, maintenance and stuff.
Well, look, it's an assumption at this point that to get the kind of performance from the network that we want, that some portions of the infrastructure will have to be large, right? This isn't a design that can run on people's gaming PCs and achieve the transaction throughput we want to achieve. So there's, yes, subject to hardware deployment constraints, that can't be a problem because people have to pony up enough hardware to make the network go.
Yeah, but I mean that making the network go is separate from being able to watch the whole network, right? Being able to watch the whole network requires...
No, that is sort of fundamentally what making the network go means. right? Like you aren't really participating in validating the network if you aren't paying attention to make sure people aren't cheating in other parts of it.
But then I don't understand what the point of regions is to begin with, right? If you're
because watching scales differently than validating. Watching scales linearly on the amount of hardware you throw at it. Validating scales exponentially based on the number of participating validators.
At least n squared with the number of communication nodes, right? Like,
right.
Because it's gossip network. So if you want to split those two functions up so that the part where you have to watch everything is linear. Right, like, and then another thing is, right, like, it's per organization, right? Like, so Coinbase can run one watcher and a bunch of different validators in various regions. Hello?
Yeah, no,
everybody's thinking.
I hear you.
Okay, sorry, I just wanted to make sure my network didn't drop.
Yeah,
so you guys didn't slash me.
So in order for watchers to be able to watch, they need to be able to see the traffic. How is adding lots of watchers going to affect how much traffic has to be sent to them, right? Do they need to have validator nodes that are forwarding them the stuff, the message that they're seeing? If you want to validate somebody else's namespace or somebody else's region, are you depending on them to send you the messages for that region?
I think in general, you depend on the collection of validators to send you the messages. And some validators may choose not to, and some validators will cooperate. In Ethereum and Bitcoin, there's some notion of your reputation that other miners will keep track of, and their willingness to send you stuff is based on that. But I'm not sure how that carries over to this situation.
That is an interesting question. How do you get a hold of the traffic? At the worst case, right? Like, you run a validator, and you try and arrange to have a validator in every region within your organization.
Still on? Greg, are you still here?
His phone was in danger of dying, so I suspect that's what happened. Let me see if I can text him.
We are coming up on the top of the hour. Does it make more sense at this point to document the open questions and the next steps? And because I think at the end of the day, there was a lot of nodding of heads and then a request for it to be written down.
Yeah, so what I recall is we've got this question of how to get hold of the traffic for the watchers. There's the request for the explicit move code for the wallets doing the exchange.
I'd also like a bit of clarity on how names are assigned to namespaces. Like, what is this countably infinite set? Where does that come from?
Both, I mean, you've got the axiom of choice with new, and then all the quoted public names in that namespace as well.
So if I type new X in P,
you'd have to say new X. You say new X colon region in P.
Or colon namespace.
Or colon namespace in P, sorry.
Okay, so you do need extra annotations on new.
Yes, and also on contracts, because you're doing for Y from this name. The name itself says where it's from, what namespace it's in. I guess you could we need to figure out whether alpha equivalence is scoped to a particular namespace or not. You know, can we say for y colon big Y from x colon big X? I mean, that would mean that but then if you sent or received on that name, it would have to be moved over to the other namespace to do its job.
I am exchanging text messages with Greg. His phone did die. He says it appears we have consensus on the model for Mercury. So yay, thumbs up. So I think if there's a few open questions or nits, we need to document them. Can we do we need another meeting, or can we do this now via written modalities?
I know how it's got to work with the alpha. The type annotation on the left-hand side of an arrow is a pattern guard. It's part of the pattern that it has to match that namespace in order to be read. Because then you can predict where the code is going to run in the body that uses that name. Does that sound right to you, Kyle?
That does sound right.
Okay.
That's runtime typing, but that's fine for now, because otherwise you have to specify, like, from now until forever what's going to be sent on a name, right? I'm going to receive the following, on which I can receive the following, on which I can send the following. And that's kind of cool, but I'm not convinced we're going to get it in for Mercury.
Okay. So that needs to be written up as part of this proposal.
And the other thing that I think needs more clarity is the function that assigns a validator set to each region.
Yeah, how do validators join particular regions? We need the whole bonding unbonding protocol to be specified for this, you know, and the bonding process should specify a region that the validator is joining.
We've talked before about if a validator is allowed to pick the region they join, then you're kind of asking for cartels to form.
That's fine.
They've got to be able to ask, because if they don't have enough, you know, if you can't do the work, stay out of the region, right? They've got to be able to say, here are my capabilities. I am committing to do this when I join this region.
Right. If that violates a security property, Mike, would you write down a rebuttal as to exactly why, so that we can have a close look? I mean, I think it makes sense to write down concerns about what could be wrong with this thing as it's being proposed. That sounds like a good one.
Sure. I'll put a comment
on
the page about validators choosing regions.
Yeah, and as far as I understand, coalitions can only choose the winners of races. Now that's a substantial power when you've got lots of parties who are trying to race for a contract. You know, it's open to the public. Whoever gets here first gets the contract.
They can also censor, right? Censorship attacks are also bad. Basically ignoring messages from a particular, like of a particular form or from a particular...
But I guess with that one, you can be slashed. If you say, look, I've been sending this stuff, it never gets in, that violates their SLA.
Let's work it out on paper, guys. We've got 3 minutes left in this meeting, and these are important questions that should be written down.
Yeah, cool. Sounds good.
Great. Meta, do you have questions about what needs to be in this that's not there now?
If I do, I will revert back to you, and I'll revert back to the team in writing.
Okay, thanks.
Let's just plan on that.
Talk to you later, guys. Bye.
Talk to you later. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.